Hi, welcome to this video on clustering. This video is in continuation of my previous video on unsupervised learning techniques, where I discussed about how unsupervised learning is different from supervised learning, and unsupervised learning is primarily can be thought of as into two different broad buckets. So unsupervised learning, just like how supervised learning was broken down into either regression or classification type of problems, one of the ways we can understand two broad categories of unsupervised learning is by thinking of it as broadly either clustering type of problems or dimensionality reduction problems. So in this video we would learn clustering, and then the next video we would have a hands-on experience on clustering, beyond which we would learn the dimensionality reduction part of it. Let's start with clustering. We would understand and develop intuition on what clustering is. We would understand various types of clustering. One of the most popular types of clustering is k-means algorithm. We would learn k-means algorithm, and then we would conclude this video with a hands-on example. Clustering is a unsupervised learning technique. A cluster is a collection of similar objects. Now understand that given any data set, each of the row it would have columns representing multiple features and rows representing multiple observations. Now each observation can be represented as a point in mathematical space, with each of the axes of the mathematical space denoting a feature. So if we plot entirety of a data set in the mathematical space, the points which would be a little together than compared to other points would become a cluster. So in two dimensional representation of the data set, uh, it would be easier to visualize this way. A bunch of points which are closer together than other points would call a cluster. So imagine this just as a cloud of points which are more similar to each other than to other points. So if your data set is bunch of emails, now a cluster would be all the emails of a particular kind. So if you take your social folder, all the emails in that folder would be closer to each other. All of this belongs to your emails triggered by your social networks like Instagram, Facebook, etc. And so you can think of it that way. Similar way, regardless of, so let's say you have height and weights, you have a bunch of observations on height and width of people, and then you plot them together, and then if you see these appear together as compared to these, and these appear together as compared, so you can form two groups. Now you would never know what these groups are, but if you then form groups and then you peek into this group and see what makes this group different from others, so this group are tall and very very wide people. This group are not so tall and not so wide people. Perhaps if we are talking about some particular sport, these might be a type of pugilists or MMA type of fighters, and these might be your sumo wrestling category fighters. So the hope was to make clustering a little intuitive. So the objective of clustering is to simplify data by reducing many features into few clusters. So if we had multiple uh, features on the same example, so where we had height, width, weight, perhaps height, width, weight, body mass index, and many other observations about multiple people, and we are able to arrive at these clusters, then we can represent the same data instead of many dimensions. Instead of using all the features, we can just say we can represent the data as just two groups. So we have straight away simplified the entire data set by assigning groups to it. So this is broad way in which clustering helps us. So by the very definition of, we need to have some notion of objects being similar or closer to each other for them to group. So for that we need to understand there needs to be a notion of distance, and we need to be very clear about what distance means. I think we have covered this part on various distances in our previous lectures on k nearest neighbor algorithms. If you don't remember, I would quickly suggest going back to those videos. Take 15 minutes and revisit those videos. However, broadly, these distances were Euclidean Manhattan Chebyshev distances. I've given formulas here, but let's understand this a little more intuitively. So this would be your data set. Any given data set, so let's say it has n rows and m number of columns. Now, each of these columns represent a feature of your data point, and each of the rows are your observations. So let's take one observation, and it has multiple features. So that means if we add one axis for each of the feature, your observation becomes one point in the mathematical space. In that sense, given some data, now this data might be an email, a medical record, a blood sample, a, any series of numbers about something becomes an observation. Every observation can be represented as a point in mathematical space. Now this is the most fundamental concept in machine learning, so I hope you guys take time to get that intuition in, but that's how the data is represented. Now if we represent our data that way, then imagine distance between any two points is the distance I'm talking about. So in mathematical space, while in three-dimensional space we can visualize two dots, and distance between two dots, these two would be like this. And in n-dimensional space, it's not possible for us to visualize, but regardless of the dimension, what we want to do is be able to measure distance between any two observations, and via that distance develop an understanding about how similar any two observations are, or how too dissimilar any two observations are. So there are many types of distances. Some of the most popular distances are Euclidean distance, Chebyshev distance, and Manhattan distance. So, however, you need not remember everything. There is a generic formula for it. So imagine these 2 points. This is the first observation and perhaps the third observation, and we're interested to find the distance. Let's stick to two-dimensional problem. Let's say the first problem had feature 1 as x1, feature 2 as y1, and with the our third observation, the feature 1 was x2, feature 2 had y2 units. The easiest way to calculate this distance is to employ Pythagoras theorem. So we have to, in essence, calculate the hypotenuse, the square of which is sum of squares of base and the perpendicular. So the base is x2 minus x1, or because we are not really bothered about the sign of it, you can take x1 minus x2, this distance, y1 minus y2, measuring this distance. The square of those gives the square of hypotenuse. So if we just want the distance between this, we underroot the entire equation. But let's say we remove off 2 and just measure it by p, and instead of under root, which can also be written as 1 by 2, we write 1 by p. Now this allows us to replace, as you would see that it need not only be squares of distances as with this. So in this equation, if I replace p with 2, it exactly becomes this. Square root can also be written as 1 by 2. Anything raised to power 1 by 2 is equivalent to saying square root of that number. So p replaced by 2 is Euclidean distance. P replaced by 1 becomes exactly same as Manhattan distance. So it would become x1 minus x2, this becomes 1, so there is no impact. So x1 minus x2 plus y1 minus y2, 1 by 1 is 1, anything raised to power 1 remains the same, so this equation becomes x1 minus x2 plus y1 minus y2. So if p is 2, it becomes Euclidean distance. If p is 1, it becomes Manhattan distance. And as you would see, it really doesn't matter what value we choose for p. As long as it's a real number, it would always give certain type of distance. And in general, if we just choose p, this equation is also called Minkowski's distance, which is a general form of capturing any possible distance. So if the number n Minkowski's number becomes 1, this formula takes the form of Manhattan distance. If this becomes 2, it takes the form of Euclidean distance, and so on. In general, the higher the number of p is, the impact of the difference in each feature is amplified. So think of it this way: if x2 was 5 and x1 was 1, so 1 minus 5 would be minus 4. If p is 1, it stays minus 4. But if p is 2, it becomes 16. If p is 3, it becomes 64. So the p, higher the number, it has a propensity to amplify the distance that we are trying to measure. And as you would see later, the peculiarity it presents is, if these axes are measured on different scales, or let's imagine one point which is an outlier, the distance would get amplified for any 2 points based on the higher the value of p, the more the distance you would see. So think of it that way. Now, why it is important, I will come to that when we are discussing the pitfalls of using clustering mechanisms. But keep this in mind that this is the generic formula to get a notion or to calculate distance between any 2 points. The reason why we need distance is to be able to get a inherent feel about how similar two observations are, or how dissimilar each observation is from the other observations. Now there are two broad types of clusterings I wanted to discuss. One is called connectivity based clustering. The other type of clustering is called centroid based clustering. Now connectivity based clustering works this way. So imagine your data like this. There are 5 points. We start by measuring distance between every possible pair of observations. So between A and E, A and D, A and C, A and B. Then B and A, B and E, B and D, B and C. And same way for every 2 possible pair of points, we start by measuring distances. And then we see what is the shortest distance. So we would have this distance, this distance, this distance. We would have all the possible distances. We would take the shortest one. In our case, it happens to be ED. We club E and D as one cluster. And instead of having 2 points, we remove these 2 points and represent this cluster by one single point, which might be midway through between E and D. So let's call that point R1 for now. So this becomes our first cluster, and instead of having 2 separate points, we represent it by 1. And then we repeat the same exercise again. We remove off all these distances, we recalculate all the distances, but now instead of E and D, we represent this cluster by one central point. So how do we get that central point? We'll come to that. But for now, think of this as representing these 2 points, or this is a representation. If you had 10 points, so imagine this to be representing all of the points within that cluster. So we recalculate distance between every 2 possible pair of points, and we do now the same thing. We again take the shortest distance. Now between A and R1 is our shortest distance. Now we club all of this in one cluster. So A, E and D becomes one cluster. So A, E and D becomes one cluster. This is R1. We can this is not a point, this is R1. So A, E and D becomes one big cluster. Again, we would remove A, E and D and represent that with, again, by calculating a central point. So earlier R1 was center for E and D. Now we have another point called R2 which was center to A, B, A, E and D. Again we repeat the same exercise. So now we have two clusters. First cluster was this. Now there is a cluster between A, E and D. And this algorithm repeats itself until it encompasses all the elements in our observation. So what's happening here is repeatedly we are seeing which of the observations are closest, and then we repetitively, iteratively do the same thing until we arrive at until we have covered the entire data set. If we represent that in a different way, so think of it as these were our starting points. After certain distance, E and D were clubbed together. So here E and D were clubbed together here, and they became one point. And then after that, A was combined with them. A was combined with them. And perhaps if we would have gone further with this, B and C would have formed the next cloud. If we would have, so imagine if this sheet extends here and we draw the next iteration as well. Perhaps it might be B and C were the next closest one, so it would form a different cluster from this. There would be one cloud here, and we would put another dot here representing B and C, and then there would be one cloud covering everything. So here is that at next distance level B and C gets combined, and finally everything gets combined. So this is just a representation of what is happening in a tree format. So if you tilt this way, it might exactly look like this. So we start with our points. E and D get combined first into ED, one big cluster. And then ED gets combined with A into a bigger cluster EDA, comprising of data points EDA. And then B and C combine together to form B and C. And then everything gets combined into one big cloud comprising of all of these. Now when this entire process is drawn these ways, these type of diagrams are also called dendrograms. So dendrogrammic representation allows us certain benefits. So let's say once this tree is formed, we want to find two broad clusters. I can put a cut here, just like how I have done with the red line, or here, and I have two broad categories here. This category here would be a combination of E, D and A. This combination would be this cluster here would be a combination of B and C. This cluster here would have E, D and A. So we have two clusters here. Let's say if you want three clusters, I can move this red line here, somewhere here, and then I can say my cluster 1 is comprised of E, D and A at this point, and then B and then C. So imagine moving this line somewhere here. We have EDA and we have B and C. They still haven't combined at this level. So what it allows us to do is for the given data set, we can chop it into any number of clusters we want. So it allows us that flexibility, and that's why dendrograms become an extremely powerful tool in clustering analysis. Now you might, a good question to ask is, we understood by the Minkowski distance or Manhattan Euclidean, these distance measures, we know how to calculate distance between 2 points. Here, this point is a cloud. This is a cloud comprising of EDA. This is a cloud comprising of B and C. How do we measure? When I said we draw a central point and then measure the distance, that was only one way of measuring. So there are multiple ways. It so happens that we have multiple ways to measure distance between two set of points. These 5 are the most popular used methods. So imagine two groups with some points. Single linkage method of calculating the distance is take the points which are closest together within these groups and the distance between them is called a single linkage. If we want to, if we take two farthest points, the maximum distance between any two points in these groups, this is called a complete linkage. If we calculate the distance from every point of a group to every point of the other group and then average out all of these distances, it's called average linkage. If we calculate centroid of one group, centroid of other group, and then the distance between centroids, it's called centroid method. Now remember when I was explaining this example, when I said we replace E and D by a centroid and then again go about calculating distances, this is the exact method I was explaining. So the way we calculate centroid is fairly simple. We take out all the distance between points and there is a specific statistical formula to calculate centroid for any given set of points. However, most of the algorithms figure these out internally and we need not worry about them much. The final and a very powerful method is also called a Ward's method. The way it works is, so think of it this way. Every time you form a cluster, let's say you formed this cluster, what you're trying to do is you have put 2 points in this cluster. So if you add A in it, now inherently the average distance between all the points has increased. So earlier the average distance within the cluster was only this much, the distance between E and D. Now when you expand the cluster to include A, you have inherently increased this part. So the average distance would always keep on increasing regardless how you expand these clusters. So it would increase. Now it so happens in Ward methods, clusters would combine using the notion that this cluster would expand in such a way it could have expanded to A or it could have expanded to C. But the reason why it would expand to A is one, if we calculate the distance based on centroid method, it would expand here because this distance was the least and it would expand here. If we were to employ Ward's method instead, so it would not calculate all these distances. Instead, it would first draw a cloud encompassing E, A and D. It would calculate what is the average distance. It would draw a cloud to E, D and C. It would calculate all the average distances. It would draw a cloud to E, D and B. It would calculate all the average distances. Now, because every time you increase this, your average distances would increase. So it would compare the increase from the original cloud to the expanded cloud. And the cloud which gives the least increase is the cloud that it chooses. So in Ward's method also, it might be that it would expand to A and expansion to A, this stage, leads to least amount of increase in this average distances or average variance within the group. Now that is the intuition behind what Ward's method is. So now you're clear about how to measure distances. To start with, you should be very clear about every observation being a point in mathematical space. And then why do we need to be able to understand distance between these 2 points? Because we need to make a sense of how similar things are. And why do we need to make a sense of how similar things are? That's the entire objective of clustering, because we want to bring together objects of similar kind into a cluster. That's why we need to understand this. So distance can be between 2 points or between 2 clusters. Now you know both ways of doing it. So distance between points is calculated using multiple ways. It might be Euclidean, Manhattan, Chebyshev, or in general using Minkowski's formula. You can calculate distance between any points. And now you also know how to calculate distance between any 2 clusters using any of these techniques. Now you would never be required to do these manually. The distance between two clusters is passed as a hyperparameter to your algorithm, just as how we passed alpha and s to our support vector machines, or k, the number of k, to our k nearest neighbor algorithm. Same way we would pass the type of linkage or the type of distance measure as a hyperparameter. Now the next broad type of clustering I want to discuss is centroid based clustering. The earlier one was called connectivity based clustering. Now we would understand a centroid based clustering. One of the most popular ways of doing this clustering is called a k-means clustering. So I would discuss k-means clustering here. This is implemented in Python by a very specific algorithm called Lloyd's algorithm, and this is just for information if you want to know on how k-means is implemented in Python. So this is called Lloyd's algorithm. So imagine these bunch of gray points as a data set. So tabular data set, as now you would be very clear, can be represented as in a mathematical space as a bunch of points. So we start with choosing how many clusters do we need. Why do we start with how many clusters? Is because when we discuss the issues with connectivity based clustering compared to centroid based, or when we understand the difference between this, that in the next slide you will be more clear on why we choose number of clusters to start with. But for now, to understand this algorithm, let's assume we start with very specific number of clusters we want. So let's say we just want 2 clusters from this data space. So what we are trying to say is we want to be able to segregate all the data points into 2 broader categories, such that every point is more likely to be same as all the other objects within the cluster than compared to the objects of other cluster. Okay, so because we want 2 clusters, we start by throwing 2 centroids at a random place. So let's say randomly we initiate one centroid here and one centroid here. Randomly, this can be anywhere, both can be next to each other, both can be anywhere. So let's say there was one centroid here, the other centroid was here. We start by calculating distance of every point from both these centroids. So imagine this point, we calculate distance of that point from this centroid and this centroid. Now to whichever centroid it lies closer, it is tagged as that belonging to that particular group. So let's say this blue was group 1, so this becomes group 1. Same way, for this we again calculate, for this observation we calculate the distance to this centroid and this centroid. Because it was closer to this also becomes blue. We do it for this, we calculate the distance to this centroid and to this centroid, it was closer to this, so it becomes blue. However, consider these group of points. So these all points would be closer to this centroid than to this centroid, so these turn red. Now we have 2 separate clusters, but remember, these clusters were arrived at by throwing centroids at a random place. So if both the centroids would have been somewhere here, everything would have been classified as one particular category. So imagine instead of here and here, there were 2 centroids initialized, one here and one somewhere here, one here and one somewhere here far off. So regardless which point you choose, the distance would always be shorter to the point which is nearer compared to the other centroid. So all of these would be classified as one class, one group. So because these are initiated randomly, our job is not done here. We need to do something more. So what's now done is, once all of these are classified into 2 broad groups, if I may, We forget about these centroids which were initiated randomly, and for these groups we again calculate a proper centroid. Now that we would have a centroid, we begin the process all over again. We again calculate distance of every point to that centroid, and again draw clusters, and again remove these centroids. Now every time, so earlier the centroid was this, so take this sample. Our initial randomly initiated centroid was this, but once we have these, if we remove this, ideally centroid should be somewhere here, somewhere in middle of all of this data, somewhere here we would find centroid. So it so happens that if you do it multiple times, sometimes it might be that when you're redoing the iteration, some points might jump over to the other cluster. So this entire cycle keeps repeating until there are no further movements between. So until no observation changes its classes for sufficient number of iterations, it continues till then, and then it stops. So this is the essence of k-means clustering. So here I've tried to demonstrate how it works. So imagine it as let me draw this for. So think of these points as our original data set. Okay, imagine these points are our original data sets, and we want to break it into okay, let's make it a little more interesting, and let's throw some more points in here of a different class. So imagine we had three, we want all of these were originally you wouldn't know the class because this is unsupervised learning. We wouldn't know the class of anything at all. So all of this would be just data points. We wouldn't know what these are. So let's start like this. So this is our data set. And we want to break it down into three broad classes. Let's say that's our goal. So somehow we want to figure out three different categories in this. So we start with throwing three random. So let's say we start with, because we want 3 points, we want to throw 3 random centroids. I'll color code these differently so that we understand which centroid is doing what into red, blue, and let's say green. So we randomly initialize this. Let's say I initialize it here, this somewhere between the data. Okay. So this is the step 1. We would initialize as many centroids as the number of clusters we want to break the data point into. The next thing algorithm would do is, for every point, it would calculate the distance between the observation and the centroid. So for this observation, it has done this the same way. This distance being the shortest, what the algorithm would do is now tag this as red. Okay, so this observation has become red. Same way, a distance between this point would be calculated to all the centroids. Now because this distance is shortest to red, it would again tag this as red. Now this looks closer to red, I'm not drawing the lines again. This perhaps is equal distance. No, this is a little closer to the red. This is definitely closer to the red. This is closer to the green. So this gets tagged as green. Is it visible? So this gets tagged as green. So this gets tagged as green. This, and this also gets tagged as green. They're closer to the green than to the red. This is closer to green than to blue. So this also becomes green. These three are closer to blue than to green, so these three are tagged as blue. Now that's the first run. That's the first run of our algorithm. So this is how it looks so far. What the algorithm does is it now removes these centroids, and then within this red it would calculate an actual centroid. So let's say an actual centroid, I'm just replicating these points. So let's say these are again new centroids. I'll color code these differently so that you are aware. This is red, this is blue, this is green. Okay. So in this cloud, it would calculate a centroid and actually put, so this looks like a center of this cloud. This becomes a centroid. For blue, somewhere here, I think it looks center of these points. And for green, it looks somewhere here. Now what it would do is, it will again start. It will forget all of the previously drawn colors, previously tags, drawn associated tags. It will again start calculating, let's say this point, it will start calculating distance to this centroid and to this centroid and to this centroid. So again, the entire calculations happens again and again, because this was closest to the red, it would get tagged as red again. But consider some points like this point. Now when the distances are calculated for this point, something strange happens. Earlier this point was closer to green because how we randomly initialized our cluster. Now it's closer to blue. So our algorithm would change the tag from green to blue now. Now this has become blue. Same way, this is closer now to red than to green, so this becomes red. This stays closer to green and okay. Yeah, so 2 points have changed. Now again, because points have changed, the algorithm would remove these clusters and remove these centroids, I beg your pardon, and again calculate for this changed. Now this cloud has changed because of this point changed, and blue also has changed because this changed from green to blue. It again draws the clusters. Now these seems to be the more appropriate clusters. It would again draw clusters, and the same thing starts all over again. It will calculate distance of every point from every other point. So if I take this point, it would calculate this distance to blue centroid, distance to red centroid. Because it's closest to green, it gets tagged green, and this entire cycle keeps repeating until no further crossover happens for a couple of iterations. That means things that are tagged red stays red, things that are tagged green stays green, and nothing changes color for at least couple of iterations. And then that's how it would arrive at this as one cloud, this as one cloud, this as one cloud, or cluster if you may. And this is how the algorithm has classified all our elements into 3 different clusters. So we start with some randomness, randomly thrown centroids, and based on repeated measures of distances, it finally arrives at the number of clusters that we want. So that in essence is how k-means clustering works. K here denotes the number of centroids. So if these are 3 centroids, that means we calculate 3. And the reason why it is called k-means is it repeatedly calculates the distance of each point and takes the shortest distance, and that's why it's called k-means. K here denotes the number of clusters. So I hope with that it gives you a little intuition around how k-means clustering works. Let's start by understanding what are the basic differences between these two types of clusterings. So we have seen connectivity based clustering. Every point, every pairwise distance is calculated. So you take any observation, the distance of that observation from every other observation is calculated. So this becomes a straightforward problem if you see the number of calculations required would be same as saying choosing two numbers from a given n set of observations. This becomes a simple combination formula, 2cn. If you have studied permutation and combination, you can expand it into n minus 1 by 2. So you need not remember the formula. Why I'm talking about this formula is, you see this n into n is n square. That means you would be requiring number of calculations which grows as n square. So if you had 5 observations, it would be 25. But just by adding one more observation, 25 computations changes from 5 square 25 to 36. So it grows in order of n square. That means after a threshold, even addition of very small amount of observations vastly increases the number of calculations that are required. But as you have seen, connectivity based clustering allows us to draw these kind of trees where we can chop it to however number of clusters we want. If we want 2 clusters, we can chop it here and then get to our two clusters. If we want 3 clusters, we can chop it here and then we have 1, 2, 3 clusters. So it allows us quite a bit of flexibility, but this flexibility comes at a cost, and this cost increases with the at the speed of n square. Compare this to centroid based clustering, where we need not calculate distance between every pair. Now what we are calculating is distance of every observation to a cluster, not amongst themselves. So if we have n points, we would calculate n points, all of these n points, we would first calculate distance to centroid 1, then to centroid 2, then to centroid 3. So n times 3. In general, we can say that given k centroids, the computation increases at the speed of k into n. Now n square and some constant into n. If n is 1000, let's say n is a million, okay? And we want to classify it into, we want to partition this data set into 3 broad spaces, 3 broad clusters. Now the number of computations required at each iteration would be 3 into 1 million. 3 into 1 million, that would be 3 million. 3 because we want 3 centroids. Compare that to connectivity based, it would be a million times million, 1 followed by 12 zeros. That would be the complexity of calculation. So while we lose what we gain by computational complexity and speed, we lose in terms of flexibility. In centroid based clusterings like k-means, you have seen that we start with making a broad assumption on the number of clusters we want. So unlike connectivity based clustering, where these are flexible enough for us to first build a tree and then choose the number of clusters, clustering we need? Centroid based clustering. We start by telling the algorithm how many clusters we need, and then we let the algorithm iteratively run and figure partition the given data set into these broad clusters. Now, given we understand what k means does, how do we choose the number of clusters? Now, typically, what happens is it's a balancing. Think of it as a balancing act between compression and noise. So, let's say given all the observations, we choose k is equal to 2. That means, even regardless of the number of observation, even if these were 10 million, we can now represent these 10 million observations just as two broad groups. So we have compressed quite a lot of information into just two things, group 1, group 2. But as we increase k, the variance between these groups get increasingly smaller, because let's say we had 3 groups. So let's say group 1 would have been like this, group 2 would have been like this, group 3 would have been like these 3. Obviously, you can see that the smaller the group gets, the variance between, or distance, average distance between these the points within that group would decrease. So the variance between the group decreases as you increase the number of clusters, but you lose your compression with it. So imagine it like this. If you have quite a lot of observations, about 10,000 people, let's say, and these observations read like their age, their gender, where do they stay, their income, how much do they spend, what do they buy, how much do they spend on retail, how much do they spend on consumables, how much do they spend on clothing, how much do they spend on entertainment. Let's say these were series of features. And then you want to broadly break this into 2 types of categories. Now, let's say k-means did that. You might as well say these type of people are one type of people and these are different set of people. The reason why this group is different from this group is perhaps because these groups tend to spend less than this group. Perhaps. But let's say you're able to break it down to 4 or 5 groups. Now you have the ability to say the reason why this group 1 is different from group 2 and group 3, group 4 perhaps is group 1 are the type of people who are impulse buyers. Group 2 are the people who would think along or who would compare multiple products before buying. Group 3 are the kind of people who would spend at discounts more. Group 4 are the people who would just spend on entertainment and not much on anything else. So while first type of classification, that these people spend less, these people tend to spend more, was a good classification. You had 2 broad categories, but the variance within that group, there were multiple type of people all clubbed into one broad group called people who spend less. But as you increase this increase the number of clusters, you can arrive at a group of people who are very very similar to each other. So compare this to a group which just says these are the kind of people who tend to spend more when they go out eating. So there you would have number of people who are very very alike. So the variance within each group decreases. So somewhere you would have to draw a balance on what do you exactly want. You want highest possible, you want a very very simplistic model where you have some basic sort of categories, or you want multiple categories where you have very clear understanding about each category. So it's a balancing act. Now, having understood both types of clustering, that is centroid based and connectivity based clusterings, and also having understand pros and cons of both, I wanted to emphasize on certain things which are very important in these type of algorithms. So these type of algorithms, at the heart of these are ability to compute, is the ability to compute distances. It's the distance from one point to other or to the centroid. But At the heart of it is the ability to calculate a distance. Now we saw there are many ways of calculating these distances. Some of the most easiest and useful ways is to do a hypotenuse type of calculation, which is also called a Euclidean distance. Now consider a case. There are two features, A and B. A is the A is measured in different units than to B. Okay, in this hypothetical toy data set. So imagine A's value being like this and B's being like this. So you can think of B as the humidity of that day and A as the number of people you observe out in a park. Okay, I'm just making this up, but these are the data sets. So when you want to calculate distance now between this and this point, let's say we want to calculate, we represent this red observation as a space here, because there are two features, we draw two axes, A and B. A at 1000, B at 2.5 becomes our point B. A at 3000 and B at 0.5 becomes our point blue. Now to calculate the distance, we take x1 minus x2 plus y1 minus y2 whole square both and under root. That becomes our Euclidean equation, which we saw earlier here, Euclidean distance. So once we calculate that, we would notice something, that this number is so large that this number becomes merely a rounding off error. So what it tells us is feature A dominates the other feature. So if there were 100 features and there is one feature which has large numbers, while calculating distance, that feature with large numbers would tend to dominate all the other features. And that way, somehow, this feature ends up influencing the decision more than any other feature. So to prevent these kind of things, so this type of thing causes clustering based algorithms highly dependent on the scale. If the scale is large, they get influenced quite a bit. And then the choice of these distance measures, a Euclidean might give one answer, Chebyshev might give other answer, Manhattan distance might give rise to a totally different end cluster. So these are also sensitive to your choice of measures. These algorithms are extremely sensitive to outliers. So if there was one observation which had A as 20,000, imagine the kind of distance it would calculate and the kind of distortion it would lead to the centroid when it's calculated. Because one observation is here, centroid would be pulled towards that observation, and you would, instead of a centroid here, you would end up having a centroid somewhere here. If there was an observation here which clearly is an outlier, compared to all of these data sets, if there was a new observation here, the outlier, your centroid would be calculated somewhere here, and it would end up influencing the way these clusters are formed. In the sense, you will end up having only a cluster around that outlier and everything becoming closer to one cloud, and that's not very desirable. In sense, that would not lead to the right kind of segregation between the data set. So it's very important to identify outliers and treat them before we use this kind of algorithms. The final assumption that this algorithm makes is, because we are drawing everything as a dimension in space, Euclidean distance especially assumes that each feature is independent of other. That means regardless of how many features, it would just use this formula, calculate a distance. But if A and B were related to each other in some way, then we would need something like a Mahalanobis distance. I've spoken about it during my lecture on KNN algorithm. I would suggest you Google around a bit on why this is used, but often if you think that your variables are not truly independent, then I would suggest instead of using Euclidean, use a Mahalanobis distance. The way this distance measure works is it starts drawing contours, and even though if point A and B are equally distant from origin, point B is more likely to be belonging to this group than A, because this is how the distance is spread. And because there is a certain pattern to this spread, we know that this axis is not independent of this axis. There is a relation. Whenever there is a relation between two axes, you see different type of patterns emerge. Data is not totally randomly spread. So whenever you have these kind of patterns, when you do your EDA, remember when you plot all these graphs, if you see any specific patterns, that means there is bound to be some relation. We need not know what that relation is, but we can assume safely that Mahalanobis distance would yield better results than Euclidean. Uh, I would not go into details of how Mahalanobis distance is calculated because it's a little mathematically involved. But to get an intuition, it starts by putting a matrix of something. So if we are trying to calculate distance between this point and B, it would measure the correlation between these axes. So x1 between x1 and x2 and y1 and y2 for these two, it would calculate how these are correlated and divide the distance measure by that correlation. So it factors in a pattern or a correlation between axes, and that's how it defines the distance. And via this distance measure, it's easily able to segregate what's different from what's more similar to a particular data set. Another interesting distance which is often used when you're trying to measure similarity between two distinct sets of data is called a Jaccard distance. It is measured as 1 minus a Jaccard's coefficient between those two data sets. So imagine the green data set and a blue data set, and they overlap. So by intuition you would know if the number of points at this overlap increases, that means they are more similar. If these two circles overlap exactly, then all the points would be within the intersection. If these two don't touch each other, then there would be 0 points within this. So the way Jaccard's coefficient is calculated is number of points at the intersection of A and B, that is these 6 which lie at the intersection of A and B, divided by total number of points in A and B. So in these we have 6 here, 6 here, 3 here, that makes it 15 as total number of points, and 6 at the intersection, so 6 by 15 becomes the Jaccard coefficient. 1 minus Jaccard coefficient would give you the Jaccard distance. Jaccard distance would always be between 1 and 0, with 1 being almost overlap and 0 being there is no similarity between the groups at all. Now I want to conclude this by giving a brief of various applications of clustering. Now, as I've said, every data point, every observation, be it an X-ray, an image, a record of something, as long as it's a series of observations or a series of numbers, this can be represented in a mathematical space, and then we know how we can group them using the various algorithms we have seen. The way it can be used is, imagine taking an image. A video series is a series of images played at a fast rate. This is what is called frames per second, FPS. So if this frames per second becomes more than 30 and more than 30, our human eye cannot distinguish the images, and anything beyond 30 frames per second looks to our human eye as a moving image. It tends to have that effect of being like a movie. So if there is any movie clip, imagine it as a series of images. Now an image is nothing but series of pixels. pixels starting from the left corner goes right, and then next row, and it would be a series of pixels, and each pixel is just a series of numbers corresponding to the amount of red, green, blue in that pixel. So we can convert any image into series of numbers, and series of images put together is a video. So now we have series of numbers, and with these numbers we know we can represent it in a mathematical space. Once we represent in a mathematical space, we can define them into clusters. So now we have the ability to use these clustering techniques on videos to identify background from foreground. You might have seen videos where there is someone speaking and the entire background gets edited out, and something else gets put there. So all the super action movies that you see, Batman, who is that guy with hammer? Thor. These are shot on something called a green background, where the background is green. These actors are recorded in front of a green screen, and later the green screen is replaced by all the fantastic effects that you see. The way an algorithm is able to edit out green is by identifying the background from the foreground. So in essence, it draws two clusters on. So first the movie gets represented as numbers, it is sent to the algorithm. It would identify only those numbers which represent the foreground part of this video, and it would segregate into another cluster all the numbers which represent the background part of the video. And now that you have two clusters, you can just edit out one cluster. So edit out the background, keep the foreground, and then add another cluster which is another background full of effects. And that's how these things work. So that's one major application of clustering. Another can be, you have series of MRI images or X-ray images. You can draw clusters, one cluster corresponding to all the good cells and the other cluster seemingly for the bad cells, and this is often used to identify malignant tumors. Another use which we already discussed was market segmentation, where it's actually used day in day out. Everything that you do gets recorded some way as a particular set of features, and all of these features combined can put you into a particular segment. So a segment might be anything like a low spender to a high spender, or a weekend spender to a sales spender, or you might be tagged as someone who would spend as soon as the product comes out. You're one of those people who would buy it earliest, or you're one of those cautious spenders who would first read all the reviews and then buy something. As long as data is available, you can be segmented into one of these segments, and then different advertising strategies are used to target different type of segments. Because of their behavior, they would react differently to different type of advertisements. Now this is the way AI works. They would automatically segment people and target advertisements to which they are most likely to respond. So that's what the entire controversy these days is about, how political campaigns are targeting certain ethnically profiled people, and that entire thing is very non-ethical. So ethnic targeting of people, so that they respond to certain type of advertisement, and maybe perhaps to influence their ballot or their vote in certain way. Those are some of the negative aspects of how these are used. Email grouping, I've already shown you how Google uses it to segment emails into your different type of folders. These might be emails coming in from marketing, from your social media primary email box, and the advertising email box. So these are broad ways. So it touches quite a lot of aspects of the world we are living in, clearly. One more thing before we conclude was, I wanted you to understand something about something called curse of dimensionality. So when I said each observation can be represented as a point in mathematical space. Now, this mathematical space would have as many axes as the number of features. Now, it so happens that every time you add an axis, the distance of 2 points increases. So if I put these two dots on 2 dimension and calculate the distance, it would be x2 minus x1 plus y2 minus y1 whole square under root. If I add a third axis, it would become x2 minus x1 whole square plus y2 minus y1 whole square plus z1 minus z2 whole square under root. Because of the additional terms, it has an effect of increasing the distance. Though these are not actually increasing, the separation is not actually increasing, but just because we have additional dimension, mathematically the number has inflated. Our representation of the distance has increased. It so happens, and there is a mathematical theory behind it, which I would not go into, but it is available on net. If you Google just cuts of dimensionality, you can find that article, that it is shown that after a certain number of features, the entire notion of the distance breaks down. That means this distance between any 2 points and every 2 points would tend to infinity, regardless how close they are in a lower dimensional space. As soon as you increase the number of dimensions, this distance keeps increasing. And at a particular point, it so happens that every distance between every two pair of points becomes infinitely large. So that at that point we lose our notion or ability to calculate distances, and all the algorithm ceases to function at that point of time. So we should be a little careful while using data sets with quite large number of dimensions, but it hits that barrier when your number of dimensions starts to increase upwards of 100,000, or you have more number of dimensions than the number of observations. That might also happen where you would hit this wall. It need not always be that number of features have to be beyond 100,000, but if you have number of features greater than the number of observations, you would still not be able to mathematically clearly calculate the distance. So that these limitations are called curse of dimensionality. So it's always good to be aware of that while using clustering algorithms. I have provided some two good links. One is an article on Medium which discusses the same thing which we covered in a very nice way. Other is the scikit-learn's own documentation, which is very comprehensive. I've also given a video which I would advise you to watch. This visually explains the same things that I have explained. So go through these, and perhaps video we will get a hands on taking an example. I would explain both the clustering mechanisms, centroid based and k-means. We would cover the hierarchical clustering, the centroid based, and the non-centroid, the other one, and the centroid based algorithm. In next video or next video series, we would study the other big branch of unsupervised learning, which is called principal component analysis. So you might remember this from when I said unsupervised learning can be broken down into two broad categories. One, clustering. The other was dimensionality reduction. While k-means is most popular method of doing clustering, PCA or principal component analysis is the most popular way of reducing dimensions. So if you like these videos, please do subscribe them and like them. If you want to support my efforts, you can also share these on your social media. That would help me gain views to this, and so that it gives me enough advertisement money to keep these classes free. Thank you so much.